Hi, I'm Yulia, and this is the News Brief Special, and today we're going to be talking about the evil that only knows how to hate, from Holocaust to Bucha. And we're going to discuss it together in the comments, so you don't have to suffer alone, and I don't have to suffer alone, because the subject today is so heavy, especially because the subject today is so heavy. And of course, please leave your questions, suggestions, comments, and constructive criticism in the comments below, because I read all of it and I appreciate all of it. Let's go. Every year on January 27th, the world not celebrates, but commemorates the memory of the victims of the Holocaust. 80 years ago, on January 27th, 1945, the Soviet troops have liberated Auschwitz-Birkenau death camp. But it wasn't just any Soviet troops. It was actually a Ukrainian division of the Soviet troops. On that day, soldiers of the 100th Division of the 1st Ukrainian Front liberated Auschwitz. This date is now recognized as International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Anatoly Shapiro, a Ukrainian-born Jewish soldier, led a specially trained division of 900 men to liberate the camp. As the Red Army advanced, the Nazis strengthened their defenses and tried to erase the evidence of their crimes. Shapiro and his division cleared mines, suppressed SS resistance, and opened the gates to Auschwitz I. Historians estimate that nearly 1.3 million people were sent to Auschwitz, and 1.1 million of them were murdered. Most of the victims were Jews from different European countries. 110,000 prisoners were Ukrainians. After the war, I thought that my generation would be the last to experience death in combat and unspeakable cruelty. Unfortunately, I was wrong. I would like to say to everyone who lives on this earth, unite your efforts and do not allow the evil that we have seen to happen again. We saw piles of sacks filled with hair, countless corpses, barely alive prisoners who looked like skeletons, the ruins of crematoria and gas chambers, and ashes. The camps smelled of death. But unfortunately, his words did not ring true, and people did allow it to happen again. We've seen it in Bucha, we've seen it in Irpin, we've seen it in Borodyanka. We also see it today when a presidential appointee to the White House, being a billionaire who sponsored a campaign, is quite literally zig-heiling at the inauguration. We have seen it today with the hatred spread towards various different nations through far-right groups in various different countries to justify dividing their own nations and gaining political power. We have seen this many, many, many times. But as of right now, it's happening very evidently, coming from Russia to Ukraine. And we're letting it happen again. I do also want to point special amount of attention towards the protests in Germany. After Elon Musk's stunt on stage and his now infamous everywhere in the world but America, because it's not being shown on mass media, speech at the AfD, German far-right party rally, where he was saying that, Germans should not bury guilt. And that was happening right before the Holocaust Remembrance Day. Germany erupted in protest all over Germany against Elon Musk and the Trump administration and everything that they stand for. And this is not being shown in America, but I want to show it to you because I think that it needs to be shown. Is history really not teaching us anything? Because when you look at these videos that I'm showing you on the screen right now, some of them are from the Holocaust and some of them are from the absolute animalistic behavior that Russia has demonstrated in Ukraine whilst invading it. And to me, they seem like two sides of the same coin, and I'm sure that to you they seem the same way. We all know what Hitler's story ended as, with, the infamous, suicide in the bunker. But do we remember how his story began? Because if you don't remember, most of the world leaders really did not want to help resistance to Hitler. In fact, there were these people on Wall Street in New York City that I love to show to you guys every single time I talk about this, who were holding posters that said, "Hitler didn't attack us. Why attack Hitler?" The West closed their eyes on Hitler's crimes and all of his ambitious, horrendous plans for a really long time, and they were trying to negotiate with him. And then World War II. Today we see the new era of the same evil, but the name of that evil is no longer Adolf Hitler. The name of that evil is Vladimir Putin. And the sad part is that still today, even with knowing what had happened in World War II and knowing what that led to, we are still not seeing the parallels. Let's negotiate with Putin. Let's not make Putin feel like a fool. Let's negotiate with Hitler. Let's not make Hitler feel like a fool. Putin is going to stop if we make concessions. Hitler is going to stop if we make concessions in the form of Austria, right? Sudetenland? But he didn't stop. He never stopped because his ambition was never to just take some territory. His ambition was to change the world order. And this is what Putin's ambition is today. And he is just starting when it comes to Ukraine. Fortunately, Europe now is realizing that. The United States still doesn't. But I mean, with the state of the world today, really, I mean, the leaders of the United States, I'm not sure which side of history they are on. You know how all of that started and how all of it happened? It's because hatred became the government policy. In the 30s, Nazis converted hate into a system. They imposed an opinion onto their people that Jews are not human. At first, those were just words, and then they converted into death camps. If you listen to Russia's propaganda, these can ring very similar to you because I'm sure you have seen before what Russia is trying to paint Ukraine as. But also, this should ring true to you if you live in Europe, if you live in the United States, because the easiest mechanism to get a nation to elect a dictator with massive ambitions is hate. Because, you know, love unites people, but not as much as hate does. Because love is a passive feeling and hate is an active feeling. And that, my friends, is from psychology. And I'm not just making it up. This works with both relationships, this works with everything. Think about, you know, how easy it is to find a mutual language with someone when you hate the same person, and how much more difficult it might be when you love the same person. And think about why hate is such a powerful driving factor. In 1942, the Nazis approved the final solution to the Jewish problem. They called it the Jewish problem, the same way as they call it the Ukrainian problem and the Ukrainian crisis. And they decided to mass murder Jews in concentration camps. However, when we talk about the Holocaust, most of what we talk about is just what happened in concentration camps outside of the Soviet Union. And millions of Jews were exterminated, but also millions and millions of people in the Soviet Union were as well. In fact, the death toll of the Soviets in the Holocaust was 6.5 to 7 million people, almost as many people as the Jews that died in the Holocaust. And the majority of the people that were killed were Ukrainians in the Soviet Union, because we were the first, literally the forefront of Germany versus the Soviet Union. People always talk about how Warsaw was so destroyed and it was so devastated, but no one ever talks about how much Ukraine was destroyed on Nazis' march towards Russia. And Ukrainians were the first people to be thrown at the front as soldiers, and they were also the first people to take the hit and the blow from the Nazis, because we were literally the first on the way to Russia. When we talk about World War II, we always talk about the Battle of Leningrad. We always talk about how bloody that was, but we never talk about all the blood and all the loss that happened in Ukraine. And it's happening again, but now from Russia, because what we also didn't mention during the Holocaust is that it wasn't just the Nazis that were destroying Ukraine. The Soviets took the time and took the opportunity to destroy and ravage through Ukraine as brutally as the Nazis did, because you know what? It'd be easier. It'd be very, very easy to pin it on the Nazis. I want you to compare these excerpts from radio, from Goebbels, from that time, to what we hear on, not the radio, but on TV from Russian propagandists today. You know, as you all know, to Russians, Ukrainians are not human.
Während der Nationalsozialismus eine neue Fassung und Formung der europäischen Kultur in die Wege leitet.
While National Socialism brought about a new version and formulation of European culture, Bolshevism is the declaration of war by Jewish-led international subhumans against culture itself. It is not only anti-bourgeois, it is anti-cultural. It means, in the final consequence, the absolute destruction of all economic, social, state, cultural, and civilizing advances made by Western civilization for the benefit of a rootless and nomadic international clique of conspirators who have found their representation in Jewry.
Internationalen Verschwörerklicke, die im Judentum ihre Repräsentanz gefunden hat.
The Kremlin's propaganda continues to expose Russia's genocidal intentions in Ukraine. Recently, Russian propagandist Anton Krasovsky called for drowning and burning of Ukrainian children who oppose Russian occupation.
Топить этих детей, топить. Прямо в тысы.
He also mocked multiple cases reported of Russian soldiers raping Ukrainian women.
Бабки гробовые бы еще все потратили на то, чтобы их насиловали русские солдаты.
The pre-recorded episode went viral and sparked global outrage. The chief editor of Russian state-controlled media RT Margarita Simonyan suspended the channel's cooperation with Krasovsky. However, shortly after that, she asked to forgive Krasovsky, and so did Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova.
За что? Просто за то, что человек много лет говорит очевидные вещи, говорит правдиво, говорит в своей манере.
Krasovsky didn't even ask for Ukrainians' forgiveness. He simply said that he got carried away and didn't see that line about the children. Like many other Russian propagandists, he crossed that line long ago. He has repeatedly suggested acts of violence against Ukrainians.
Мы отнимем у вас вашу конституцию.
И сожжем ее на Красной площади, на лобном месте?
Нет, посажим ее на Крещатике вместе с вами на ваших же огнях, как вы любите.
This is another call for genocide.
Сука, этой страны не должно быть. И мы сделаем все, чтобы ее не было.
RT permitted such hateful comments. This is unsurprising, as fueling genocidal language is regular practice on Russian state TV. While Ukrainian authorities continue to collect mounting evidence of Russian atrocities across the country, Russian propagandists incite more war crimes in Ukraine, calling to destroy critical infrastructure and cause more human suffering.
Вот смотрите, насколько изменило общественное настроение удар в ночь с воскресенья на понедельник по Харьковской ТЭЦ. Насколько вчера изменило настроение удар по гидроузлу. Но непонятно, почему это не происходит каждую ночь, почему это не происходит по всей инфраструктуре. Мы миллион раз говорили, что уничтожить инфраструктуру Украины вообще не сложно.
Massive attacks on Ukraine's public infrastructure followed. Since October the 10th, Russia has killed many civilians and damaged almost a half of Ukraine's energy system, disrupting electricity supply for millions of people. The Kremlin's pundits have openly rejoiced over human suffering in Ukraine.
День настал! Наконец-то Россия начала бить киевский режим.
Following Krasovsky's remarks, other Russian propagandists, like radio host Sergei Mardan, also urged the killing of Ukrainians.
Как они называются, прекрасным арабским словом «шахид» или прекрасным русским словом «герань», лишь бы оно летало и падало на головы хохлов.
And of course, he used the Russian slur for Ukrainians. Classic. These are just some of the recent examples of how aggressive Russian propaganda is against Ukraine. Genocidal rhetoric by Russia against Ukrainians has continued for months. It has followed years of dehumanization of Ukrainians since Moscow occupied Crimea and parts of Donbass in 2014. With the onset of the full-scale invasion, Russia's genocidal rhetoric against Ukrainians has escalated with each of Moscow's losses on the battlefield.
Все, всех победим. Всех убьем, всех, кого надо, ограбим. Все будет, как мы любим.
The Kremlin's propagandists have justified and encouraged torture, rape, and other war crimes in Ukraine. Their narratives repeatedly prove that Russia's war is not only against Ukraine's government or military, it is against the existence of the Ukrainian people.
You can't kill your neighbor if you see them as human. But what if they tell you the neighbor is a cockroach? In 1994, in Rwanda, this is how the genocide started. People were told on the radio that Tutsis are not human.
Over the following decade, Rwanda transitioned to an independent republic with a Hutu government. This new administration argued that as the majority group, Hutu deserved exclusive access to political power. They excluded the Tutsi minority by appointing offices based on population and prohibited the return of Tutsi families that had fled years earlier. Hutu extremists also circulated propaganda, blaming Tutsi for the country's economic, social, and political problems. Discontent with their life in exile, a small group of Tutsi insurgents invaded Rwanda in 1990, beginning a violent civil war. The conflict lasted 3 years before it was resolved with a formal peace accord. But the war's aftermath was rife with insecurity. While some civilians in both groups remained amicable, the treaty intensified political polarization. And in 1994, when a plane carrying the Hutu Rwandan president was shot down, the conflict broke out anew. This time, Hutu officials had prepared a deadly response to ensure they stayed in power. Working off a list of targets, government-funded Hutu militias flooded the streets, perpetrating acts of physical and sexual violence against Tutsi political enemies and civilians. Over the chaotic following months, over 1 million Hutu civilians joined their ranks due to coercion, self-preservation, or the pursuit of personal agendas. Tutsi victims sought refuge at churches and schools where they hoped international organizations would protect them, but no outside party came to their aid. UN soldiers who'd overseen the peace accord were instructed to abandon Tutsi civilians, and UN leadership refused to acknowledge the genocide taking place. The violence didn't end until mid-July, when the Tutsi army, who instigated the previous civil war, seized control of the country. By the time the fighting was over, roughly 800,000 Rwandans had been killed, and only a small fraction of the Tutsi population was left alive.
And this propaganda in Rwanda resulted in 800,000 people killed in 100 days. Usually, as I said earlier, hatred is what results in the most damage, because when you instill hatred in people, it's very easy to make them act on a cause. You know, in America, the hatred is being put on illegal immigrants, but it's not really on illegal immigrants, it's really on anyone who's brown, right? In Hungary, it's towards any immigrants. In Russia, it's towards Ukrainians. In France, it's towards Arabs. In many other countries, it's towards Muslims, right? We install hatred into the majority of the population, and then the minority of the population is being perceived as the issue. And that's how most of the genocides start, because we find things that we can't relate to, that cannot be pinned on us, right? So we are safe. So we don't feel like these rules and these regulations are ever going to result in anything negative for us. And that's why it's so easy. I'm going to show you a clip of the 1945 anti-fascist advertisement in the United States.
I've heard this kind of talk before, but I never expected to hear it in America.
This fellow seems to know what he's talking about.
Yes, he knows all right.
What's the answer? What are we real Americans going to do about it? You'll find it right here in this little pamphlet.
Excuse me, young man, but are you actually going to read that stuff?
Sure, why not? You heard what he said, didn't you?
Yes, I heard. But do you believe in that kind of talk?
I don't know, makes pretty good sense to me.
I'm speaking to you as an American. And I tell you, friends, we'll never be able to call this country our own until it's a country without. Without what? Yeah, without what? Without Negroes. Without alien foreigners. Without Catholics. Without Freemasons. You know these people.
What's wrong with the Masons? I'm a Mason. Hey, that fellow's talking about me.
And that makes a difference, doesn't it?
These are your enemies.
I was born in Hungary, but now I am an American citizen. And I have seen what this kind of talk can do. I saw it in Berlin.
What were you doing there?
I was a professor at the university. I heard the same words we have heard today. But I was a fool then. I thought Nazis were crazy people, stupid fanatics. But unfortunately, it was not so. You see, they knew that they were not strong enough to conquer a unified country. So they split Germany into small groups. They used prejudice as a practical weapon to cripple the nation. Of course, that was not easy to do. They had to work hard to do it. You see, we human beings are not born with prejudices. Always they are made for us, made by someone who wants something. Remember that when you hear this kind of talk. Somebody is going to get something out of it, and it isn't going to be you.
Does it now ring a bell as to how easy it is to incite and ignite a nation to hate? And I really keep coming back to the United States, but compare the similarities. Compare the similarities to Russian propaganda, and honestly, there are more and more similarities between America today and Russian propaganda, and it scares me, but we're going to stick to Russian propaganda. If you have ever listened to the Russian news or listened to Russian propagandists and heard the denazification narratives, then you would probably recognize them as Ukrainians are not human. That's basically the main motto of what Russia's propaganda is trying to do, and you could probably tie it to this video and see why it's done and how it's done. We're being called Ukro-Nazis, Ukrops, Benderites. This is quite literally how Russian propaganda imposes onto its people and onto its citizens the idea that Ukrainians are not human, and therefore we are the cockroaches that need to be exterminated. And you know, doing that is not a crime against humanity, should not be prosecuted in the International Criminal Court. It's, in fact, a necessity. And what does the Russian army do? Well, they're exterminating entire families. They are torturing peaceful civilians. They are sexually assaulting women and children, and they're impregnating women and children because they need to bear Russian babies because Ukrainians cannot reproduce. They castrate Ukrainian soldiers so they couldn't reproduce. And if that does not remind you of the Holocaust and the ideology and the methodology, then I don't know what would. Ukrainian cities that currently exist under Russian occupation are open-air concentration camps where Ukrainians cannot do or say anything because it could result in them being taken to a filtration camp, which is essentially a glorified torture basement. This is a war for the extermination of the entire nation. And the fact is that Russian state propaganda is quite literally calling on its people to support and to love and to commit an extermination and a genocide of Ukrainians as a nation. You guys in the West, for some reason, are not clear on what the goal here is, but Russians on their TV are very clear. You just like to discount it. And you think because it happened in the 1930s and 40s, it's not going to happen again. Because obviously it's a different situation and it's not nearly as serious. But those people on Wall Street who were marching against attacking Hitler because Hitler didn't attack us, don't you think they thought the same thing? They thought that nothing is going to come of it and it's not their problem. If you ever thought to yourself, what would I have done in World War II when Hitler was in power to stop him? What you're doing today is exactly what you would be doing at that time. If you are not sure that the world needs to be acting against Putin, you would not be sure if the world needed to be acting against Hitler, and so on and so forth. And I'm not saying that to put guilt on you, I'm just saying that the thinking here would be the same. Bucha, Irpin, and Mariupol showed you a new level of cruelty in modern era. In 2022, Russia did all of the same things that Nazis were doing in World War II. In Bucha, they were executing people just on the street while they were walking or riding their bicycle. They were executing them. They were killing them execution style with their hands tied behind their back, and they were quite literally throwing them in mass graves. In Irpin, they were assaying children. In Mariupol, they sent a missile into a theater that had children written in front of it as you know, a warning that there were lots of children hiding from the rain of missiles from the sky. There were hundreds of civilians in that theater, and it's estimated that over 400 people died there. This is not a war. This is ethnic cleansing. When Ukrainians have liberated Ukrainian settlements and Ukrainian cities in Kharkiv and Kherson region, our army found hundreds of mass graves. And all of those mass graves were filled with civilians that didn't do anything. Their crime was being Ukrainian. The same as the civilians in World War II, whose only crime was being born Jewish. The civilians in Ukraine that were thrown into mass graves were executed with their hands behind their back. They had visible signs of torture. Some of them were missing parts of their body that were cut off from them when they were alive. They all were showing visible signs of deliberate and horrendous torture. If that doesn't remind you of World War II, I don't know what will and how else I can get through to you, because when the whole world said never again, we kind of meant never again until we forget about what happened, or never again until it happens to someone we don't care about, or never again until, you know, we need to have a lot of convincing to understand that it's happening again. So the conclusion here is that Putin needs to be stopped before we actually get to the point of being in 1940s. Because right now we're in 1938 or 1939. We still have a chance. We still have a chance to avoid World War III, and we still have a chance to avoid many, many, many millions more of mass casualties. The shots of Hitler before 1939 in Munich are so comparable to the shots of Putin at various parades in Russia. These are two of the same coin, just one side and the other. In 1930s, Great Britain and France did not want to go to war with Hitler. I mean, why would anyone go to war? And they decided to sign agreements, you know, the same agreements that Ukraine is being forced to. They're being forced into a peace deal, into a deal. And they were calling it, both then and now, as peace talks and achieving peace. And then Second World War happened, and millions more people died. What we're trying to tell you today is that the West is scared again to give Putin, this era's Hitler, a real answer, a real blow, a real deterrent, because signing peace papers and peace deals and peace agreements is really only going to lead to history repeating itself, because it already is, and it's so incredibly hard to watch. What's going to happen next? He's not going to stop at Ukraine. The next step is Poland, the Baltics. If we're not going to stop him now, the price we're going to have to pay is going to be World War III and more lives. Because when you say that you want a peace deal to save lives, what lives are actually going to be saved when in Russian occupation, civilian people are being murdered and tortured just for their identity and just for having been born Ukrainian? Military action stops, but the war and the torture and the suffering of the innocent civilians, as you say, does not stop. The only barrier that we have between suffering and between the suffering that Russian army is inflicting on us and on civilians is the Ukrainian army fighting against that suffering. Hitler did not stop after Sudetenland, and Putin is not going to stop at Ukraine. Evil doesn't stop by itself. It needs to be stopped. Today, we have a chance to do it without a global war, but that chance gets slimmer and slimmer and slimmer every day. So make conclusions, and that's all I have for you for today for Food for Thought. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more videos like this, of course, sign up for this channel, become a subscriber and turn on your notifications so you don't miss when the next videos and segments come out. And like this video, send it to a friend, because honestly, I feel like a lot more people need a reminder of what World War II started as and what it was like, because they're really not recognizing it today. And leave your questions, suggestions, comments, and constructive criticism down below. I read all of it, and I love interacting with you guys. And it's been honestly it's been quite active in the comments, and I've been really enjoying it. So yeah, keep it up, and I will see you next time.